Some of the greatest headphones in this hobby have been dynamic driver based. For starters, there's the Sennheiser HD650 and HD800. Whether you like them or not, they're iconic and widely respected by many audiophiles. Then we have the amazing Focal Utopias, the ZMF Verites and the ZMF Atriums. More examples of outstanding dynamic driver designs. And now we have another dynamic driver design trying to get in on that mix. This is the Moondrop Horizon headphone. It has a number of similarities with some of those other models I've just been mentioning, but it's also a very different headphone in its own right. Firstly, it's much cheaper than any of those at just $200 US. And then it's a bit of a hybrid of bits and pieces from all those headphones, not suggesting it's been stolen, just that you can see similarities in the designs, because after all, there are only so many ways you can design a headphone. And on top of that, there are things that we just know work well when it comes to headphone design. So every brand is going to do them in different ways. For example, the Horizons had the same angled driver design as something like an HD800. It's done a bit differently here, but the driver is set forward and angled back towards the ears. The drivers themselves are coated in metal, somewhat like you might find in a Focal Utopia or a ZMF Verite. Admittedly, here it's a titanium driver as opposed to beryllium in those headphones, but still it's a metal-coated driver, which should improve things like rigidity and the damping of the driver itself. At the back of the headphone, we see a very, very open design, somewhat like something like an HD650. And then when we start to think about the tuning and the sound of these, it's got a slightly warmer tuning that's a little bit like, not that much, but a little bit like the ZMF Atriums. And the result overall, when we compile all those little tiny similarities, is something that's not actually like any of the other headphones I've just talked about. Not directly anyway. And by the way, Shenzhen Audio sent me the Moondrop Horizons for review, but as always have no influence over the content of this video. Instead, this video is sponsored by Dakoni Audio. If you want a simpler, neater set of cables for your various headphones, or maybe you want different sounding or different style comfort pads for your headphones, you can get all of those sorts of products from Dakoni Audio with a 10% discount too. But they've also just released a brand new product for the donglers amongst us. The Dakoni MagDAC will attach magnetically to the back of a phone that's equipped with the MagSafe magnets, and it will provide for you a couple of snug elastic band type pouches that you can then put things like a dongle and even your various plugs and cables into. That's going to hold your DAC nice and snug to your smartphone like so. And so it becomes a great way to simplify your everyday carry down to just a phone with this one thing stuck on the back of it and all the cables managed by being attached to the phone, whilst also preventing accidental dongle disconnections from dongles dangling dangerously. And so to get the brand new MagDAC or any of the other awesome accessories from Dakoni Audio, all you need to do is go to dakoniaudio.com, and when you get to the checkout, enter the code PassionForSound10 to get 10% off anything you're purchasing. And of course, products like these from Dakoni Audio make a great purchase for Christmas presents for audio-loving friends and family, so now's a great time to get shopping with that 10% off. Enjoy! And now, let's get back to the Horizons. These are pretty easy to drive with an impedance of 32 ohms and sensitivity of 94 decibels per milliwatt. That means that most people will be able to enjoy these at safe listening levels with less than 1 milliwatt of power. And that's despite the Horizons using a large 50mm dynamic driver. They're very sensitive drivers though, because they're very lightweight, and that also means that the overall headphone weight is very light too. The Horizons are an extremely comfortable headphone for very long listening sessions because they're all very light, and the pads and the headband are very comfortable too. It's also worth noting that they don't clamp particularly firmly on the head. They're a fairly lightweight and very easy style clamp, but if you do want a slightly firmer clamp, there's no reason you couldn't bend this headband slightly so long as you're careful. As I've already said, the pads and the suspension band here are very comfortable. They're a nice fabric finish on the bits that touch your skin. And if you do want to swap pads, say to maybe some Dakoni Audio pads, it's very easy to do so because they use an excellent magnetic attachment system. The Horizons also come with a decent cable. It's not amazing, but it's fine. And I like the fact that it's got a swappable plug, so you can have 3.5mm or 4.4mm terminations. And when you put all of that together and rest a pair of Horizons on your noggin, what you're going to hear is a sound that's pretty natural and what I'd call relatively neutral. In other words, they're not heavily coloured, but they're also not cold or clinical. However, how you hear the Horizons may depend a little bit on what you've listened to just beforehand, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we do though, let's talk just about the Horizons, and the first thing I'd say is their treble is very extended, but generally very well controlled. That means they're non-fatiguing for extended listening, unless you happen to be somebody that's a little bit sensitive to upper treble peaks. The treble peak in the Horizons tuning isn't as large as it is on some other brands and models of headphones, but it's probably just enough that some people may find it annoying, and for me it was enough that it occasionally just threw off the naturality of the timbre of the Horizon headphones. It's not bad, and it's not really glaring, but it's enough that you just sometimes notice that the treble's not quite as natural, smooth, or kind of part of the mix as everything else might be. At the other end of the scale, the bass from the Horizons is excellent, and they sound like they actually extend deeper than the measurements would suggest. What I mean by that is not that the measurements are wrong, but that the way the bass is delivered, they don't sound like they roll off as significantly as they actually do. For example, the double bass in Wrap Your Troubles in Dreams had a good sense of body, presence, and weight to its sound. It didn't sound at all like the headphones were running out of puff at the lower registers. And to take that a step further, as I listened to genres with more punchy, rhythmic and driving bass, the Horizons sounded great. As is often the case, how lower frequencies are heard and perceived as we listen to them is often more about how they're delivered as opposed to exactly how they're measured. And what I mean by that is that two headphones can measure quite similarly and yet have a quite different listening experience. That's the case with the Horizons. They measure like they've got significant roll-off, but they sound like they're pretty solid in the bass. And so we don't forget about everything in the middle of the treble and bass. It's also worth mentioning that the mid-range from these is equally well balanced with everything else. It's a very nice tonal balance from bottom to top, with the exception of that little bit of a treble peak at the very top end of the treble. And so outside of that, I think the Horizons are a very well tonally balanced headphone. And then if we step outside of just tonality and timbre and think about things like staging and imaging, you might expect the Horizons to have this huge, expansive soundstage because they do similar things with the driver placement to something like an HD800. Unfortunately, it doesn't translate the same way here. The staging from the Horizons is definitely not bad, but it's also definitely not an HD800 type experience. And that means that the soundstage from these is not exceptionally large or deep, and it's about on par with anything else at around the same price. Which is to say that it's acceptable and it's fine, and it's probably a really good segue into starting to understand the competition for the Horizons. And where I began the hunt for competition was with the significantly cheaper HiFiMAN HE400 SE. These to me are the headphone that every other headphone has to beat if you're going to justify spending anything more than $109, which is the price of the HE400 SEs these days. But as I started to compare the Horizons and the HE400 SEs, what I noticed was that it wasn't a question of which one was higher quality of sound, so much as which one had the tuning that I preferred. When you compare the Horizons with the HE400 SEs, the Horizons come across as the way more laid-back headphone. After coming from the HE400 SEs, the Horizons sound dark and warm, but I actually think the Horizons might technically be closer to neutral or natural sound, in other words, what you would hear with the live musicians. And I also think that despite the HE400 SE delivering a slightly more open and spacious sound, and maybe a little bit more detail because of their slightly brighter tuning, despite all of that, I also think that the Horizons are the headphones that I would choose to listen to more often. To me, depending on the tracks you're listening to and the source chain that you plug them into, the HE400 SEs are much more likely to get fatiguing and tiring after extended listening. On the other hand, the Horizons are very easy to listen to for very extended listening sessions because of that warmer and more laid-back sound compared to the HE400 SE. Now, what you might see and hear around the internet about the Horizons is that they've got kind of a dark, veiled treble sound to them, and I definitely get where that's coming from. There's a cut in the treble on the Horizons at about the 4 kHz mark, and I think it's both a blessing and a curse for them. It makes them very easy to enjoy with any music, from any device, and for as long as you want to, but it does rob them of a little bit of a sense of clarity and energy in the treble range. And so some of you will want to take that into account before you buy a pair of Horizons, if that's something you're considering, or You may want to make the most of the very simple pad fitting system and try playing with pad rolling. For a start, there's all this foam in the back of the pads that some of you might choose to rip out and play with. And for other people, you might choose to buy yourself some aftermarket pads from brands like Taconi Audio. To be clear though, I don't think the veil is a problem, and I think in some cases it's actually a benefit to the headphones. It's just more a point of difference that some people are going to love and other people aren't going to love so much. However, if you are about to drop $200 on a pair of Moondrop Horizons, you probably want to see what else is out there. And one such option at about the $200 mark is the FiiO FT1 Pro. And the most obvious difference that stood out to me between the FT1 Pros and the Moondrop Horizons was in the bass. The FT1 Pro has noticeably better bass extension and therefore noticeably better weight down low in the bass range. It has a sense of foundation in the bass, solidity in the bass, that the Horizons just can't match. That said, on most music I listen to, I didn't really find myself missing the bass from the Horizons, so much as just becoming more aware of it when I went to the FT1 Pros. I do think the FT1 Pros are probably more technically correct to the music, but the Horizons are far from bad, they're just different. Another area where the FT1 Pros might have an edge for a number of listeners is that they do have a slightly brighter and more present treble that's also very well balanced. That means they deliver a greater sense of texture and detail in the upper registers than what you can hear from the Horizons. But again, some are going to prefer the Horizons, others will prefer the FT1 Pros. The Horizons have that more smooth sounding treble, but the FT1 Pros highlight a little bit of a problem with that. That spike in the treble that I mentioned earlier becomes a little bit of an Achilles heel because of the Horizon's very smooth treble design. And what I mean by that is that whilst the FT1 Pros have more treble, their treble comes across as smoother because it's very consistent. The treble from the FT1 Pros sounds natural and correct, whereas it sounds a little bit uneven in the Horizons despite being very smooth because of that little peak at the very end. Basically what I'm saying is that the Horizons almost highlight their own weakness by being so smooth for most of the treble range and then just a little peak at the end. That smoothness makes the spike more obvious and it ends up throwing off the overall tonal balance. And as a result then, because the FiiO FT1s have more consistent treble all the way from I think 3 kHz to about 13 kHz, they come across sounding smoother and more natural in the treble despite having more of it. And so I probably slightly prefer the tonality of the FT1 Pros over the Horizons. And then again, if we step away from tonality and think about things like staging, I find that the staging and the imaging from both headphones is very similar. The FT1 Pros create an image that's a little bit higher in the soundstage, higher in the head you could say, but beyond that they're not really better or worse, they're just a little tiny bit different. And ultimately, I find both of these headphones very enjoyable. The Horizons are a little bit more comfortable because of their super lightweight, but I think the FT1 Pros are the headphone I would reach for more often because I like their very natural and balanced tonality from bottom to top. That said, if you have a brighter or more energetic or clinical sound chain, or you just want a slightly more laid back listen, the Horizons are an excellent choice. And as always, I'll put some links in the description down below where you can pick up the Horizons if that sounds good to you. Or as an alternative, I'll pin my video here at the end about the FT1 Pros from FiiO and why I think they're probably the very best headphone choice for $200 unless you're specifically looking for something a bit more laid back like the Horizons. So watch the FiiO FT1 Pro review next, but until next time, peace, love and music, and I'll see you here again soon.